When we picture George Washington, our minds almost automatically jumps to the heavy, dramatic history, right? We see the stoic general suffering through a freezing blizzard, or maybe the incredibly solemn, unsmiling first president of a branding nation. But actually, before all of that, there was this absolutely crucial, much quieter 15-year period that literally forged the man who would go on to lead a revolution. So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into George Washington, love, land, and politics, looking specifically at the highly transformative years from 1759 to 1774. Understanding this specific window of time is absolutely essential because it reveals the intensely personal reasons why a man who seemingly had it all decided to risk the gallows.
Okay, let's dive into this. What turns a wealthy, retired farmer finding absolute peace into a radical rebel? We are going to explore the immense, almost unbelievable contrast between Washington's idyllic, deeply fulfilling home life and his impending, completely unavoidable radicalization. Why on earth would a man who had finally built his perfect sanctuary, a man whose deepest desire was just to be left alone on his land, risk absolutely everything to tear down the greatest military and economic empire on the planet? Well, to understand the rebel, we really first have to understand the peace he was fighting so hard to protect.
Section 1. A return to peace. Okay, set the scene in your mind. The year is 1759. Washington has just resigned his military commission. And you really have to remember, he was carrying the incredibly heavy trauma of his early military failures fighting in the Ohio Valley during the French and Indian War. I mean, this guy had survived humbling defeats, freezing rivers, and literally had bullets ripped through his coat during disastrous ambushes. He was exhausted. So returning to his estate in Virginia allowed him to finally, genuinely take a deep breath. He threw himself completely into rebuilding Mount Vernon. He had actually inherited this rather modest estate from his beloved half-brother Lawrence, but Washington didn't just maintain it. He completely transformed the place. He basically channeled all that immense physical energy and strict military discipline into architecture and estate building. He expanded the mansion significantly and added that beautiful, famous, high-columned piazza overlooking the rushing waters of the Potomac River. For the first time since he was a kid, he put down the sword and focused entirely on building a lasting life, turning Mount Vernon into one of the most recognized and magnificent homes in all of colonial America. Section 2. The Innovative Farmer. Washington possessed a highly analytical mind, and his daily agricultural life quickly became his new grand campaign. Instead of just doing what everyone else did, relying on standard soil-depleting tobacco crops like traditional Virginia planters, Washington was constantly experimenting. Tobacco was notoriously hard on the earth, and worse, it kept planters locked in a vicious cycle of debt to British merchants. Washington saw right through this trap. So what does he do? He heavily studies the absolute latest European farming techniques through imported books and relentless letter writing. He completely shifts his fields over to wheat and grains. He builds a commercial grist mill. He even started a highly profitable commercial fishery on the Potomac. He was far, far from a passive gentleman farmer. He was this driven, intellectual agriculturalist who wanted to push the absolute boundaries of what his land could do and ultimately secure total economic independence. Section 3. Partnership with Martha. But, Mount Vernon wasn't just about the land, the crops, and the architecture. At its core, it was about family. Backing up just a bit to 1758, a year before his military retirement was finalized, Washington met Martha Dandridge Custis. She was a 26-year-old widow, enormously wealthy, completely controlling an estate of thousands of acres following the death of her first husband. But far more importantly than her wealth, she had this immense presence and a warmth that just immediately put people at ease. Imagine the two of them in a warm, candlelit Virginia parlor during their very first meeting. Martha looks right at him and warmly says, "Colonel Washington, I have heard a great deal about you." Right away, you can sense her confidence, right? It immediately shows her practical intelligence and her enormous magnetic presence. She clearly wasn't intimidated in the slightest by his towering physical height or his growing military reputation. And Washington's response is wonderfully disarming. He replies, "And I hope, Mrs. Custis, that what you heard was, at least partially, true." He's slightly flustered, sure, but highly charming. This little exchange gives us such a vital taste of the very real, very human being behind that stoic, unsmiling marble legend we usually see in the history textbooks. He was completely drawn to her intellect and her deeply grounded nature from the very first evening they met. And Martha replies with a small, bright smile, "Rather more than partially, I think."
This snappy, rapid-fire banter is just incredibly telling. It reveals an instant, genuine connection between the two of them that honestly had absolutely nothing to do with her vast wealth or his rising social status. It was just two highly capable people connecting on a very real, very equal level, recognizing a profound shared strength in one another.
So they married in January of 1759, and what they formed was a completely equal partnership. They seamlessly managed the incredibly complex, sprawling operations of Mount Vernon together. Running a plantation of that size was literally akin to running a small, self-sustaining village. Martha took over the highly demanding domestic side with incredible efficiency. We're talking overseeing the production of textiles, managing the massive food stores, and flawlessly hosting the hundreds of guests who traveled through their doors every single year. Meanwhile, Washington managed the large-scale farming, the mills, and the business exports. Martha wasn't just some companion standing quietly in a shadow. She was his absolute equal, the steady anchor that kept him completely grounded.
Section 4. Taxes and growing resistance.
Sadly, the peaceful, beautifully ordered bubble that George and Martha had built at Mount Vernon was about to be aggressively invaded. The peace he fought so desperately hard to cultivate simply was not going to last in the face of a changing empire. During this time, Washington took his seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the colonial legislature down in Williamsburg. Sitting there, actively participating in local governance, his political awareness began rapidly sharpening. Following the end of the French and Indian War, the British Parliament desperately needed money, and they decided, without asking, that the American colonies were going to foot the bill. Washington watched this ideological shift from the British crown with a growing, incredibly quiet unease. He was taking the steady erosion of colonial rights very, very seriously. So the crucial point we need to understand is represented right here by this number, 3,000. 3,000 miles. That is the massive, incredibly dangerous ocean distance between the plantations of Virginia and the halls of Parliament over in London that were suddenly making all of these restrictive new rules. Think about the sheer indignity of being legally and financially controlled by men 3,000 miles away, in a room where not a single American held a seat or a vote. To Washington's profound sense of fairness, order, and autonomy, this was deeply, deeply offensive. And as we look at this timeline, we see a pattern of relentless taxation building systematically over the years. It starts in 1765 with the Stamp Act, which basically taxed essentially every single piece of printed paper in the colonies. Then it moves to 1767 with the Townshend Acts, placing duties on glass, lead, paint, and paper. And then, of course, it hits an absolute boiling point in 1773 with the Tea Act. Washington watched one tax after another get passed into law, and because of that beautifully independent, self-sustaining life he had meticulously built, each of these compounding taxes felt less like a distant political policy and more like a deeply personal insult. It was a direct threat to the sanctuary of Mount Vernon and the very livelihood of his family.
Section 5. The reluctant revolutionary.
It's absolutely vital to understand that Washington was not quick to anger. He wasn't some hothead naturally looking for a fight. Unlike men such as Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant philosopher who could endlessly argue human rights theory, or Patrick Henry, the fierce firebrand whose impassioned speeches could set a crowded room ablaze, Washington was highly practical. He was a man of action, a soldier, a farmer, a builder. He strongly preferred to try economic boycotts and quiet resistance first. Honestly, he wasn't a natural revolutionary. But here's the thing. Even the most practical, incredibly reasonable men have their breaking points when they are pushed, cornered, and repeatedly ignored by the exact same authority that claims to govern them. We finally see his breaking point in this incredibly powerful private realization. Picture him, sitting at his desk, late at night, reading a letter, feeling the immense, heavy burden of British overreach literally threatening everything he and Martha had built. His jaw tightens and he writes, "Taxed without our consent, governed without our voice. How long must freemen endure this? How long before we answer?" This marks the absolute climax of his personal radicalization. The quiet farmer who just wanted to be left alone in peace, he's gone. The rebel has fully awakened. Slowly, quietly, over 15 long years, the British crown had pushed a man of peace past his absolute limit. The question was no longer whether he would act, but when. When would this practical builder from Virginia finally step off his beloved porch overlooking the Potomac, walk out onto the world stage, and literally change the course of human history forever? So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to think about something. Think about how a person's deepest, most profound desire for peace and personal autonomy can sometimes, ironically, be the exact catalyst that forces them into a war. Keep that question bouncing around in your head as we leave the quiet sanctuary of Mount Vernon behind.